The smell of the creek mud was iron cold in the early morning, carrying a faint, organic sweetness underneath that Elliot Marsh could not name until he realized it was the smell of old bone. He was already at the edge of the Caudill bottomland at first light, kneeling in the damp earth where his survey stakes had disturbed the eroded bank the previous afternoon. The hollow was submerged in a thick, gray mist that clung to the timber-stripped ridges, muffling the sound of the water moving over the stones. Marsh wore a heavy canvas field coat, but the chill of the Appalachian morning seeped through the fabric, settling into his joints as he prepared his tools. The limestone shelf above him was gray-white and damp, marked by a heavy rust-orange streak where iron in the soil had leached through the rock over decades. Beneath that shelf, the earth had given way, and the fragment of human femur he had covered with his canvas jacket yesterday was waiting for him. Marsh was a methodical man, literal-minded, and anchored by the physical reality of measurements, coordinates, and tangible evidence. He had grown up in Cincinnati, surrounded by the predictable geometry of city grids, and he was visibly uncomfortable in the wild, claustrophobic geography of Harlo County. But he was also too stubborn to retreat from a task once he had begun it. He unfolded his steel trowel. He did not begin by pulling at the exposed bone. Instead, he started 6 inches away, scraping away the dense, loamy soil in precise, millimeter-thin layers. The silence of the hollow was absolute, save for the rhythmic rasp of the metal edge against the dirt and the low, continuous murmur of the creek. It took him 2 hours of painstaking labor to expose the perimeter of the burial. As the dark earth fell away, the geometry of the dead man emerged, and with it, the undeniable fact of deliberate concealment. The body had been placed face down in the earth. The skull was turned slightly to the right, the cervical vertebrae compressed by the weight of the soil that had been packed over it. More telling were the arms. Marsh used a stiff bristled brush from his kit to clear the dirt around the ribcage, revealing that the hands had been positioned deliberately beneath the torso, trapped between the dead man's chest and the floor of the shallow grave. It was not a natural resting posture. It was the posture of a man who had been dropped into a hole, or perhaps bound, though no rope or twine had survived the acidic soil. Near the pelvis, the edge of the trowel clinked against something hard that did not resonate like bone or river stone. Marsh cleared the area with his thumb, wiping away a clump of wet clay to reveal a rusted metal belt buckle. It was heavily oxidized, the iron flaking away at the edges in brittle orange scales, but the rectangular shape and the heavy central prong were intact. It rested exactly where the waistband of a pair of trousers would have sat. Marsh stood up, his knees aching from the damp cold of the ground. He wiped his hands on a rag and retrieved his survey camera from its heavy leather case. He set the wooden tripod in the creek shallows, leveling the legs with the same practiced efficiency he used for his transit instrument. He took 4 photographs of the exposed skeleton from different angles, bracketing the exposures to account for the deep morning shadows pooling beneath the limestone shelf. The mechanical click of the shutter sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet ravine. When he was satisfied with the photographic record, he pulled his leather field notebook from his breast pocket. With a mechanical pencil, he sketched the burial site. He noted the orientation of the skeleton, head pointing roughly north-northeast, and the specific depth of the grave relative to the limestone overhang. He drew a detailed, enlarged sketch of the rusted belt buckle, capturing the specific curvature of its corners and the thickness of the prong. He recorded the face-down posture and the trapped hands. These were fixed facts. In a place like Harlo County, where words shifted and memories seemed to evaporate upon request, Marsh trusted only what he could measure and document. He packed his tools, covered the remains once more with his jacket, and began the 2-mile walk to the town of Caudill Crossing. The hollow road was a narrow track of packed dirt and crushed stone that wound between the steep ridges. The depression had gutted whatever cash economy had ever existed here. The farms he passed were subsistence operations, quiet and weathered, the houses sitting back from the road like wary animals. Marsh felt the weight of unseen eyes from the porches, though no one called out to him. He was a federal man, and his presence meant the New Deal dam was coming. The dam meant the water was coming, and the water meant the end of the hollow. The Harlo County Sheriff's Office occupied the front half of a brick building that also served as the county tax assessor's space. When Marsh pushed through the heavy wooden door, the only person present was Deputy Weston, a thin, pale man in a starched shirt who was carefully copying names from a ledger into a bound logbook. "Morning," Marsh said, stepping up to the wooden counter. Weston did not look up immediately. "Help you?" "I need to report a body," Marsh said, his voice flat and professional. "Human remains, exposed by the federal survey on the Caudill bottomland." Weston was in the middle of writing a surname. His pen stopped. He did not complete the loop of the letter. He held the pen perfectly still against the paper for a long, agonizing second, the dark ink pooling slightly and bleeding into the fibers of the page, before he slowly lifted it and set it down on the desk. He did not ask if Marsh was sure. He did not ask if it might be an animal. The immediate, profound discomfort on the deputy's face signaled to Marsh that this was not an ordinary bureaucratic moment. "Where exactly?" Weston asked, his voice tight, his eyes fixed on the blot of ink. "North end of the parcel, creek bank under a limestone shelf." "You stay here," Weston said. He stood up, abandoning the ledger, and walked quickly out the back door of the office without looking at Marsh again. Marsh waited in the quiet room. He took out his notebook and jotted down the time. 15 minutes later, the front door opened and Sheriff Amos Prater walked in. Prater moved much faster than Marsh expected for a man of his size and age. He was heavy through the shoulders, carrying a thick layer of fat over a frame built for hard labor, and he wore a tarnished deputy star from 20 years ago pinned to his suspenders rather than his current sheriff's badge. He chewed tobacco with a slow, rhythmic grind of his jaw, his eyes sharp and assessing beneath the brim of his hat. Prater did not offer his hand. He walked directly to the counter, looked at Marsh, and asked 3 questions in rapid, unbroken succession. "Where exactly on the parcel? How deep in the bank? You told anybody else about this?" Marsh looked at the sheriff, processing the interaction. The lack of preliminary greeting, the absence of basic surprise. Prater had not asked if the remains were human or how Marsh had found them. He had asked for geographic coordinates and containment. It told Marsh instantly that Prater already knew what the skeleton meant, and that his primary concern was controlling the information. "North end, right on the boundary line," Marsh answered evenly, refusing to be rushed. "About 3 feet down from the top of the bank, exposed by erosion and my survey stakes. And no, I came straight here." Prater stared at him for a moment, his jaw working the tobacco. Then he turned toward the door. "My truck's outside. Show me." The sheriff's truck was a battered Ford that smelled of dust, old oil, and the sharp, acrid tang of chewing tobacco. As they drove back up the hollow road, the tension in the cab was palpable to Marsh. But Prater seemed determined to pave over it with a sudden, expansive friendliness. "This dam project," Prater said, keeping his eyes on the rutted road, his large hands draped casually over the steering wheel. "It's going to be a hard thing for a lot of folks. But it's good for the county. First real federal money we've seen in a generation. Jobs clearing the basin, new roads. It's progress. Can't stop progress, no matter how much some of these old families might want to." "It's a massive undertaking," Marsh agreed cautiously, watching the trees pass. "That it is," Prater said. "And you boys have a tight schedule, I imagine. Army Corps doesn't like to wait. They want those acquisition maps drawn up yesterday." Marsh listened to the sheriff talk about the reservoir, the projected water levels, and the compensation boards. For the entire 2-mile drive, Prater did not ask a single question about the skeleton itself. Any genuinely curious person, especially a lawman, would have asked about the condition of the bones, the apparent age, whether there was clothing, whether it could be a missing person. Prater asked nothing. He talked about the future, aggressively ignoring the past that Marsh had just dug up. They parked on the shoulder of the road and walked the quarter-mile through the brush to the creek bank. The sound of Prater's boots on the creek bank gravel was a deliberate, unhurried crunch. As they approached the exposed earth beneath the limestone shelf, the crunching stopped. Prater halted 2 feet short of where Marsh had been crouching earlier. The sheriff looked down at the bones. He did not crouch down for a closer look. He did not lean in to examine the crushed vertebrae or the rusted belt buckle. He stood with his hands in his pockets, chewed his tobacco for a moment, and then turned his head to spit a dark stream into the creek. "Pre-Civil War," Prater said. His voice carried the smooth, frictionless ease of a man delivering a line he had rehearsed. "We get this sometimes. Old pioneer graves, sometimes older. Creek washes out the bank and up they come. Nothing for the law to worry about." Marsh stared at him. "Pre-Civil War?" "That's right. Sheriff, the body was buried face down. The hands are positioned beneath the chest. That's not a traditional pioneer burial." Prater looked at Marsh, his eyes flat and hard beneath the brim of his hat. "I'm telling you what it is, Mr. Marsh. It's an old grave. Now, about your survey timeline. You've got a lot of ground to cover. Seems to me the easiest thing for everybody would be if you just moved your survey line south a few yards. Leave this bank alone. No need to complicate your federal project with a bunch of paperwork over some 100-year-old bones." It was the first open conflict between them. Marsh felt the cold air of the hollow pressing against his back. He was a surveyor, not a policeman, but he knew the regulations of his agency, and he knew when he was being managed. "I can't do that," Marsh said, his voice perfectly level. "The acquisition boundary is fixed by the topography of the basin. I don't have the authority to move the line, and I have a federal obligation to document anything found on land subject to federal acquisition. I've already photographed the site." Prater's jaw stopped moving. He looked at the camera case resting on the stones, then back at Marsh. "You took pictures." "Standard procedure," Marsh said. Prater held his gaze for a long time. The pleasantness had entirely vanished from his face, leaving something heavy and immovable in its place. "You do what you have to do, Mr. Marsh. But I'm telling you, you're digging up nothing but dirt." Prater turned and walked back toward the road, leaving Marsh alone with the dead man. At midday, Marsh returned to the Bledsoe boarding house. It was a large, drafty Victorian structure that had seen better days before the timber money dried up. Marsh's room was on the second floor. He sat at the small wooden desk by the window, acutely aware of the texture of the boarding house wallpaper, a brown floral pattern that had been rubbed smooth at shoulder height by the passage of previous occupants, the brittle yellow paste showing through in irregular patches. He unlatched his portable typewriter and fed 3 sheets of paper into the roller, separated by 2 sheets of blue carbon paper. He began to write his formal federal incident report. He detailed the coordinates of the find, the depth of the grave, the orientation of the skeleton, and the presence of the metal buckle. He was acutely aware that as a surveyor, he had no law enforcement authority. He could not compel an investigation. But he did have the weight of the United States Army Corps of Engineers behind him, and he had a strict federal obligation to document and preserve anything found on the land. He intended to use that bureaucratic obligation as his lever. If he filed the report, the machinery of the federal government would have to acknowledge it, making it infinitely harder for Prater to simply sweep the bones into the creek. When the report was finished, he went downstairs to the dining room for lunch. Harlan Bledsoe, the owner, was in the kitchen, but the 2 other boarders were already seated at the long table. One was a traveling dry goods salesman named Witt, a man with a quick smile and a habit of talking too much. The other was an older man whose name Marsh had not caught, who made a meager living repairing farm equipment for the Harlo families. Marsh sat down, served himself from a bowl of beans and cornbread, and waited for a lull in Witt's monologue about the poor condition of the county roads. "Let me ask you both something," Marsh said casually, keeping his eyes on his plate. You know the families around here pretty well. What can you tell me about the Caudill family history, specifically the older generation? The clinking of silverware stopped. The silence that fell over the table was sudden and absolute. Whit cleared his throat, his quick smile returning, though it did not reach his eyes. The Caudills? Oh, they've been here forever. Good people. Keep to themselves mostly, like everybody else in the Hollow. Farm the bottomland. Why do you ask? Just trying to get a sense of the local history, Marsh said, for the survey records. Who held the original title? The older man wiped his mouth with a cloth napkin. That'd be the family, he said. His voice was gravelly, devoid of inflection. They've always held it. But who specifically? Marsh pressed. Ferris Caudill? Ferris is the one you talk to, Whit said smoothly. If you need anything regarding the land, Ferris is the man. Very helpful, very civic-minded. Has he always been the one in charge? Far as I know, Whit said. He looked at the older man. Ain't that right? Far as anyone needs to know, the older man said, picking up his fork again. Marsh recognized the performance immediately. Both men had given answers that were technically responsive. They had spoken words, formed sentences, maintained a veneer of polite helpfulness, but they had conveyed absolutely zero information. It was a practiced evasion, a communal defense mechanism. They knew exactly what Marsh was asking, and they knew exactly how to not answer him. That afternoon, the sun baked the dampness out of the hollow, leaving the air thick and heavy. Marsh returned to the Caudill bottomland to continue his measurements. He set up his transit instrument on a slight rise about 50 yards south of the creek bank, peering through the telescope to align his crosshairs with a distant ranging pole. When he lowered his eye from the lens, Cecil Slusher was standing at the parcel boundary. Slusher was a rangy, red-faced man whose property abutted the Caudill land to the east. He wore faded denim overalls and a sweat-stained felt hat. Across his right forearm, he carried a long-barreled percussion cap rifle. He was not pointing it at Marsh, but the casual way he held it, the sheer physical presence of the weapon, was impossible to ignore. Marsh did not flinch. He pulled his field notebook from his pocket, made a notation of his last measurement, and nodded briefly in Slusher's direction. Slusher did not nod back. He did not speak. He simply stood at the edge of the tree line, his eyes fixed on Marsh. Marsh turned back to his instrument. He adjusted the leveling screws, checked the plumb bob, and recorded another set of numbers. Every few minutes he would glance up. Slusher was still there. The man did not shift his weight, did not lower the rifle, did not offer a single word of explanation or threat. The silence stretched out, becoming a physical weight in the humid air. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then 30. Marsh continued to work, forcing his hands to remain steady, refusing to let the intimidation alter his routine. He walked the chain, drove a wooden stake into the ground, and tied off a length of bright orange surveyor's flagging. 40 minutes after he had arrived, Slusher turned on his heel and walked back into the trees, disappearing into the deep shadows of the ridge. Marsh let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. The encounter was profoundly unsettling precisely because nothing had happened. There had been no shouting, no demands, no overt threats that Marsh could report. It was an exercise in pure psychological pressure, a demonstration that Marsh was being watched, that his presence was tolerated only on a razor's edge, and that the violence of the hollow was always present, just standing quietly at the boundary line. Night fell over Harlo County, with the suffocating darkness typical of the deep mountains. In his room at the boarding house, Marsh lit the kerosene lamp on his desk. The yellow light threw long, wavering shadows against the rubbed, smooth floral wallpaper. He unrolled his preliminary survey maps, weighting the corners with his compass, his ink bottle, and 2 heavy brass plumb bobs. He traced the lines of the parcels with the blunt end of his pencil. The Caudill bottomland was the largest and flattest tract in the hollow, the the prime real estate that the reservoir would eventually swallow. As he studied the boundary lines, a specific geometric detail caught his eye. He cross-referenced his field notes from the afternoon with the county's preliminary plat map. The creek bank, the exact spot where the skeleton was buried beneath the limestone shelf, sat at the precise center of a disputed boundary line. According to the old, fragmented records Marsh had been given in Cincinnati, the line separating the Caudill claim from the adjacent properties of 3 other families was contested. It had never been formally resolved. Marsh stared at the map. The body was not just buried on Caudill land, it was buried on the seam of a conflict. This was the first concrete indication that the land dispute and the dead man might be connected. If the boundary was contested, the presence of a body there was a massive liability for whoever claimed the land. Or perhaps the body was the reason the boundary was contested in the first place. He pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward him and uncapped his fountain pen. He needed to write a letter to his Army Corps supervisor in Knoxville, describing the find and requesting formal guidance on how to proceed with the acquisition timeline, given the presence of human remains. He began to write, his pen scratching loudly in the quiet room. Pursuant to the ongoing survey of the Harlo County Reservoir Basin, I am reporting the discovery of human skeletal remains on Tract 4, Caudill. He paused. He thought about Prater's rehearsed lie. He thought about the hands trapped beneath the chest. He thought about Slusher standing at the tree line with a rifle. He wanted to write that he suspected the death was recent, that it was a deliberate homicide, and that the local sheriff was actively obstructing the discovery. But Marsh had been in trouble before. 2 years ago, on a project in the Ohio Valley, he had raised alarms about a local contractor's corrupt land grading. He had been right, but he had been loud, and he had lacked the ironclad proof required to protect himself from the political fallout. His superiors had nearly fired him, citing his lack of cooperative temperament. He had been sent to Harlo County as a last chance, a difficult assignment to test his ability to follow protocol. If he made wild accusations of murder and conspiracy now, without absolute proof, Knoxville would pull him off the job and bury the report. Marsh carefully edited his thoughts. He kept only the verifiable facts. He described the location, the depth, the orientation of the bones, and the fact that he had photographed the site. He did not mention murder. He did not mention Prater's behavior. It was a decision that reflected his hard-learned caution, but as he sealed the envelope, he knew it also meant he was limiting his official support going forward. He was entirely on his own. Before getting into bed, Marsh sat on the edge of the mattress and opened his leather field notebook one last time. He turned to the page where he had sketched the rusted belt buckle. He studied the drawing in the lamplight. The rectangular frame, the heavy, distinctively shaped central prong, the specific curvature of the metal. Prater had said the grave was pre-Civil War. But Marsh was a man who noticed details, a man who understood the manufacturing of metal. The buckle design in his sketch was not from the 1850s. It was a mass-produced style, stamped rather than forged. He recognized it clearly. It was a style that had been common in the 1890s through the 1910s. The man in the creek bank had not died a century ago. Marsh took his mechanical pencil. He drew a small, dark circle around the sketch of the belt buckle. Beneath it, he wrote a single word, pressing hard enough to indent the paper. Recent. He closed the notebook. The silence of the boarding house pressed in on him, heavy and expectant. He knew now, with absolute certainty, that Sheriff Amos Prater was lying, and that the Hollow was hiding a killer. The morning light in Harlo County did not arrive all at once. It bled down the steep, timbered ridges of the hollow in slow increments, gray and hesitant, as if the sun itself were reluctant to touch the bottomland. Elliot Marsh sat at the small wooden table in his room at the Bledsoe boarding house, fully dressed in his canvas field trousers and heavy boots. He had been awake for an hour, listening to the floorboards groan under the weight of the house's occupants. In front of him lay his leather field notebook. It was open to the middle. Marsh was a man who lived by measurements. He knew the exact weight of his transit instrument, the precise length of his stride, and the specific order of the pages in his notebook. He did not need to count them to know that a page was missing. It was the page immediately preceding his sketch of the rusted belt buckle, a page that had contained his preliminary list of adjacent property holders along the Caudill boundary line. The paper had been excised cleanly, likely with a razor, leaving only a microscopic fringe of white along the binding. He closed the notebook, slid it into his breast pocket, and went downstairs to the dining room. The air in the boarding house kitchen was thick with the smell of chicory coffee and rendering pork fat. Harlan Bledsoe, the owner, stood near the cast-iron stove, wiping his hands on a flour sack apron. Bledsoe was a narrow, stooped man whose eyes perpetually darted toward the door, as though expecting a sudden wind to blow it open. Marsh poured himself a cup of the bitter coffee and stood at the edge of the kitchen. "Mr. Bledsoe," he said, his voice level, carrying no accusatory edge. Bledsoe turned. "Morning, Mr. Marsh. Breakfast is near ready. The other gentlemen are just coming down." "I have a question about my room," Marsh said. "I noticed a page missing from my field notebook this morning. It was left on the desk." Bledsoe did not drop the rag. He did not blink in surprise. He simply shook his head with a smooth, practiced rhythm. "I couldn't say anything about that, Mr. Marsh. I don't go into the rooms once they're let, except to change the wash water, and I didn't do that this morning. Must have fallen out on your walk." It was the smoothness of the denial that caught Marsh's attention. A man accused of theft, or even questioned about a missing item in his own establishment, should exhibit some degree of offense, or at least confusion. Bledsoe showed neither. He was not surprised that the page was gone. He was only mildly, politely regretful that Marsh had noticed. "It was bound paper," Marsh said. "It doesn't fall out." "Well," Bledsoe said, turning back to the stove, "old things come apart. That's just the way of it." Marsh did not press the issue. He did not accuse Bledsoe directly. He took his coffee to the long dining table, pulled out a chair, and made a mental note. The boarding house was not a neutral space. He was sleeping behind enemy lines, and his room was subject to inventory. After a breakfast eaten in near silence with the other boarders, Marsh drove his government Ford truck out of the hollow and took the ridge road toward the county seat. Caldwell Crossing was a dying town, a collection of brick and clapboard structures clinging to the banks of a shallow river. The Depression had hollowed out whatever cash economy had once existed here. The storefronts were dim, the windows dusty, and the men who stood on the corners wore clothes that had been mended until the men's themselves were fraying. Marsh parked in front of the county courthouse, a squat stone building that looked as though it were sinking into the mud. He walked inside and found the county land office at the end of a dark, unheated corridor. The smell of the county land office hit him immediately. Coal dust, damp paper, and the particular dry rot of records that have been stored without heat for years. It was the scent of bureaucratic decay. Behind a wire mesh window stood a clerk in a frayed wool sweater, sorting through a stack of yellowed tax receipts. "I need to pull the deed history and boundary records for the Caudill bottomland parcel," Marsh said, sliding his federal identification across the counter. "And the adjacent claims." The clerk barely glanced at the ID. He looked at Marsh with eyes that were clouded with cataracts and profound indifference. "Caudill bottomland," the clerk repeated, his voice like dry leaves scraping across a porch. "Can't help you." "Are the records in use?" "They're ash," the clerk said. "All the records for that parcel, and the 3 next to it, were destroyed in the courthouse fire. 18 years ago. Marsh frowned. "All of them? There are no duplicate filings at the state level?" "Not from before the fire. It took the whole back room. Everything from the original land grants up to 1918. Marsh leaned against the counter. A fire that selectively destroyed the records of the exact parcel where a man was buried in the creek bank was a statistical improbability that Marsh's mathematical mind rejected instantly. "I see," Marsh said. In that case, I'd like to see the official fire report from 18 years ago, the fire marshal's assessment of the cause, and the inventory of the destroyed documents. The clerk coughed, a wet, rattling sound, and shook his head. Can't help you with that either. Why not? Because the fire report was kept in the records room, the clerk said, entirely deadpan. It burned up in the fire. Marsh stared at the man. The circularity was too perfect. A fire had destroyed the records, and the record of the fire had been destroyed by the fire. It was a closed loop of missing information, designed to offer no handholds to anyone trying to climb back into the past. Marsh took his notebook from his pocket, opened it to a fresh page, and wrote the clerk's explanation down verbatim. Leaving the courthouse, Marsh drove back to the Hollow. The federal mandate required him to establish the historical boundaries of the land before the dam project could proceed with acquisitions. If the paper records were gone, he would have to rely on the oral history of the adjacent property owners. He parked the truck at the edge of the timberline and began to walk the Hollow road. The road was little more than a pair of deep wagon ruts carved into the mud, winding past subsistence farms that clung to the sides of the ridges. He stopped at the first farm, a dilapidated structure with a sagging porch. A man in overalls was splitting kindling in the yard. Marsh introduced himself and asked if the man knew the history of the Caudill land, specifically a man named Dolan Caudill. The man stopped swinging the axe, looked at Marsh for a long, silent moment, and said the name was unfamiliar. He then turned his back and resumed chopping. At the second farm, a woman hanging laundry on a line of twine gave him the exact same response. She did not look him in the eye. She simply shook her head, said the name was unfamiliar, and picked up another wet shirt. At the third farm, an elderly man sitting on a stump whittling a piece of hickory claimed he had only lived in the Hollow for a few years and knew nothing of the Caudills, despite the fact that Marsh could see a family graveyard on the hill behind the house with headstones dating back to the previous century. The uniformity of their ignorance was staggering. It was not the natural forgetting of a community. It was an organized, rehearsed amnesia. Marsh walked another mile up the road until he reached the fourth farm. The yard was barren, save for a few scratching chickens. An older woman sat on the porch, snapping beans into a tin bucket. Her name, according to the mailbox post, was Hattie Owens. Marsh approached the porch, removed his hat, and introduced himself. He asked his question again. "Ma'am, I'm trying to establish the property lines for the bottomland. Did you know a man named Dolan Caudill?" Hattie Owens did not look up. She continued snapping beans. Marsh realized she was nearly deaf. He stepped closer and repeated the question, raising his voice to cut through the quiet of the Hollow. "Dolan Caudill!" The woman's hands stopped. She stared out at the tree line, her eyes milky and unfocused. When she spoke, her voice lacked the inflection of natural conversation. "Dolan went west," she said. She did not say it like a memory. She said it with a flatness that sounded like repetition, as if she were reciting a line she had learned long ago and had been ordered to repeat whenever the cue was given. "When did he go west?" Marsh asked loudly. "Dolan went west," she repeated, her tone entirely unchanged. She dropped a snapped bean into the tin bucket. The metallic ping echoed sharply. She did not say another word. Marsh thanked her and walked back to the road. The phrase echoed in his mind. Dolan went west. It was the Hollow's official story, a collective lie agreed upon to explain an absence. He continued down the road until he reached a structure that stood in stark contrast to the decaying farms. It was a one-room schoolhouse, painted white, with a neatly swept dirt yard and a stone chimney. The school day had ended, but the door was propped open to let in the afternoon breeze. Marsh stepped inside. The room smelled of chalk dust and oiled wood. At the front desk sat Nola Garnett. She was a woman in her late 40s, thin and precise, with her hair pulled back into a severe bun. She was grading papers with a fountain pen, her movements sharp and economical. "Miss Garnett?" Marsh asked. She looked up. Her eyes were dark and intelligent, assessing him with a rapid, calculating gaze. "You are the surveyor," she said. It was a statement, not a question. "Elliot Marsh. I'm with the Army Corps." "I know who you are, Mr. Marsh. The whole Hollow knows who you are. What can I do for you?" Marsh decided on a pretext. "I'm trying to map the local geography, specifically the historical boundaries of the bottomland. The county records are gone. I was hoping you might have some knowledge of the area's history." Nola Garnett set her pen down. She was guarded, but she did not use the Hollow's standard non-answer technique. She did not claim ignorance. "The bottomland has been Caudill property since the original land grants," she said. "The boundaries follow the creek on the west, the ridge line on the east, and the old stone wall to the north." She answered his questions precisely, neither offering more nor less than what he asked. Her grammar was impeccable, her tone entirely neutral. As she spoke, Marsh's eyes drifted to the shelf behind her desk. Stacked neatly between bookends were dozens of composition notebooks. The color of Nola Garnett's composition notebooks caught his eye: black and white marbled covers, the same type sold at general stores throughout the region, but her name was written on each spine in a precise schoolteacher's hand. They were arranged chronologically, dating back decades. "What are those?" Marsh asked, pointing to the shelf. Nola Garnett's posture stiffened by a fraction of an inch. She did not turn to look at the shelf. She kept her eyes locked on Marsh's face. "Just records," she said. She did not elaborate, but she watched his face as she said it, her gaze heavy with an unspoken challenge, waiting to see if he possessed the intellect to understand what she was not saying. Marsh held her gaze for a moment, recognizing the weight of the silence between them. He thanked her for her time and left the schoolhouse. That afternoon, Marsh returned to the survey site at the creek bank. The exposed limestone shelf where he had found the skeleton was still covered by his canvas jacket. He set up his transit instrument and began taking measurements of the elevation. 30 minutes into his work, he felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. He turned. Cecil Slusher was standing at the edge of the parcel boundary, 30 yards away. He was a rangy, red-faced man, wearing a faded flannel shirt and mud-caked boots. Cradled across his forearm was a long-barreled percussion cap rifle. The sound of Slusher's rifle stock tapping against a fence post drifted across the clearing, a slow, irregular rhythm like someone thinking through a decision. This was the second day in a row Slusher had appeared at the edge of the site. Yesterday, Marsh had ignored him. Today, Marsh had had enough of the Hollow's silent intimidation. He left his transit instrument, walked directly across the damp earth of the bottomland, and stopped 10 feet from Slusher. "I'm Elliot Marsh," he said. Slusher stopped tapping the rifle. He looked at Marsh with a mixture of contempt and raw aggression. "I know who you are. You're the government man digging holes where he ain't wanted." "I'm conducting a federal land survey," Marsh said. "This bottomland is slated for acquisition." "This is Caudill land," Slusher said, his voice a low, gravelly snarl. "And you got no business digging in it." "The federal acquisition gives me precisely that business," Marsh pointed out, his tone remaining perfectly level. "If you have a legal claim to this parcel, you can file it with the Army Corps office in Knoxville. Otherwise, you are interfering with a federal operation." Slusher's face darkened. He turned his head and spat a stream of brown tobacco juice onto the toe of Marsh's boot. "You'd do better to finish your measurements and go home, surveyor," Slusher said, "before the Hollow decides you've overstayed your welcome." Slusher did not wait for a response. He turned and walked back into the tree line, the rifle resting easily on his shoulder. Marsh looked down at the tobacco juice on his boot, took out a handkerchief, wiped the leather clean, and walked back to his instrument. That evening, back at the Bledsoe boarding house, Marsh sat in the parlor. The room was sparsely furnished, smelling of stale pipe tobacco and lemon oil. The other 2 boarders were present: Whit, a traveling dry goods salesman with a loud suit and a desperate need for conversation, and an older man who repaired farm equipment and rarely spoke. Marsh decided to probe the waters. "I had a run-in with a man named Cecil Slusher today," he said casually, opening his notebook. "He seemed rather protective of the bottomland." The older man stopped packing his pipe, looked at Marsh, and then looked away. He did not say a word. Whit, however, was merely indiscreet rather than hostile. He leaned forward, eager to share local gossip. "Slusher? Lord, I'd steer clear of him, Mr. Marsh. Man's got a temper like a kerosene fire." "Is that so?" Marsh asked, keeping his pencil poised. "Oh, absolutely," Whit said, lowering his voice conspiratorially. 3 years ago, he got into a boundary dispute with a neighbor over on the East Ridge. Claimed the neighbor's fence was 2 feet over his line. They argued for a month. Then, one night, the neighbor's barn just happened to burn straight to the ground. Lost his mules, his winter hay, everything. "Was Slusher charged?" Marsh asked. "Charged?" Whit laughed nervously. "Sheriff Prater went up there, asked a few questions, and ruled it a lightning strike. Even though there wasn't a cloud in the sky that night. Nobody crosses Cecil Slusher. He's a violent man." Marsh wrote this down. Slusher, history of violence, arson over land disputes. "Why does he care about the Caudill bottomland?" Marsh asked. "He doesn't own it." Whit glanced toward the kitchen to make sure Harlan Bledsoe wasn't listening. "He doesn't own it, no, but he farms 4 acres of it, has for years. It's an informal arrangement he has with Ferris Caudill. Slusher grows his corn there, keeps the profit, and in exchange he acts like a watchdog for the Caudills. But if the federal government takes that land for the dam..." "The arrangement ends," Marsh finished. "Exactly," Whit said. "Slusher loses his best acreage, and there ain't no paper deed to get him compensated. He's protecting his livelihood." Marsh retreated to his room. He sat at his desk and looked at his notes. The pieces were beginning to align into a coherent structure. Cecil Slusher was a violent man with a history of extreme action over land disputes. He had a direct financial motive to protect the bottomland from federal acquisition. He was aggressively patrolling the survey site where the skeleton was buried. Marsh began building the case against Slusher in his notebook. It made logical sense. Slusher had killed the man in the creek bank, perhaps a drifter, or perhaps someone who had threatened his access to the land, and buried him there. Now, the dam project threatened to expose the grave and ruin his informal farming arrangement. Slusher's aggression was simply consciousness of guilt. The next morning, day 3 of the story, a heavy mist clung to the bottomland, turning the trees into pale, ghostly silhouettes. Marsh returned to the skeleton site carrying his field kit and a long cloth tape measure. He removed his canvas jacket from the exposed earth. The skull was still hidden deep in the bank, but the ribs, pelvis, and femurs were visible. Marsh worked with absolute precision. He staked the corners of the burial site, running the cloth tape measure along the length of the remains. He recorded the exact orientation. The body was face down, the hands positioned beneath the torso. As he used his folding trowel to clear away a clump of roots near the ribcage, the metal blade scraped against something hard. It did not sound like bone. Marsh set the trowel down and used his fingers to sift through the damp, black soil. He extracted a small, circular object. He wiped the dirt away with his thumb. It was a small, brass button. Marsh held it up to the gray morning light. The texture of the brass button was distinct, small, 4-hole, with a faint stamped pattern that had been partially worn away by decades in the soil. It was not from the same era as the rusted belt buckle he had found near the pelvis. The buckle was mass-produced, turn of the century. This button felt older, perhaps late 19th century, but from the same general period of the region's history. Marsh frowned. The button was an anomaly. If Cecil Slusher had killed a man recently to protect his 4 acres of corn, why was the victim wearing clothing with hardware from 30 or 40 years ago? It was an inconsistency. But Marsh was a man who had finally found a theory that made sense of the Hollow's hostility, and he was reluctant to abandon it. He took a clean white handkerchief from his pocket, dropped the brass button inside, folded it carefully, and placed it in his kit. He filed it away without examining the inconsistency yet. He needed professional confirmation of the burial date to solidify his case against Slusher. Returning to the boarding house at midday, Marsh sat at his desk and drafted a letter to a state medical examiner contact he knew in Knoxville. He wrote in precise, clinical language. He enclosed his detailed sketches of the skeletal remains, the measurements of the bones, and the depth of the burial. He asked for a professional assessment of the burial date based on the degradation of the bone and the soil composition. He deliberately did not mention the brass button or the rusted belt buckle in the letter. He told himself it was because artifacts could be misleading, easily dropped or mixed into the soil by flooding. But in truth, he omitted them because he was still composing his theory around Slusher, and he had not yet understood that the artifacts were pointing somewhere else entirely. He sealed the envelope and walked to the Caldwell Crossing post office to mail it. That afternoon, Marsh decided it was time to speak to the man who legally controlled the land. He drove his truck up the winding dirt track that led to the Caudill farmhouse. The farmhouse sat on a rise overlooking the bottomland. It was a large, sturdy structure, built of heavy timber and fieldstone, projecting an air of permanence that the other farms lacked. As Marsh parked and walked up the path, a man emerged from the front door and stood on the porch. This was Ferris Caudill. Ferris was a man in his late 50s, slow-moving and deliberate. He had a broad, flat face, deeply lined by the sun, and hands thickened from decades of farm work. He wore a clean white shirt buttoned to the collar and dark trousers. He watched Marsh approach with an expression of mild, polite curiosity. "Mr. Marsh, I presume?" Ferris said. His voice was deep, resonant, and entirely devoid of the hostility Marsh had encountered elsewhere. "Mr. Caudill," Marsh said, stopping at the base of the porch steps. "I appreciate you taking the time." "Not at all," Ferris said, gesturing to a wooden rocking chair. "Will you sit?" "I prefer to stand," Marsh said. "I have some questions regarding the federal survey of your bottomland." Ferris smiled. It was a gentle, accommodating smile that did not reach his eyes. "Of course, we want to be as helpful as possible. We know the government has a job to do, and our family has always believed in cooperating with the law." Marsh noted the pronoun, we, our. Ferris spoke as though he were a monarch representing a sovereign state. "I'm trying to establish the historical chain of title for the parcel," Marsh said. "The county records were destroyed in a fire. I understand you are the steward of the land, but the original title was held by a Dolan Caudill." Ferris nodded slowly, his broad face projecting a pantomime of sorrow. "Yes, my older brother Dolan. He was the title holder." "Where is he now?" "We couldn't say for sure," Ferris said, his voice dropping to a respectful, mournful register. "Dolan was a restless man. The farming life didn't suit him. Many years ago, he packed a bag and went west looking for wage work. We never heard from him again. It was a great tragedy for our family." Dolan went west. There it was again. The exact same phrasing Hattie Owens had used, delivered with the exact same lack of specific detail, but wrapped in a veneer of brotherly grief. "And you assumed control of the land?" Marsh asked. "Someone had to ensure the hollow didn't fall to ruin," Ferris said smoothly. "We made arrangements. We kept the families together. We hope that when the federal project comes through, it will be fair to the families of the hollow. They have worked this land for generations." "I found something on the bottomland, Mr. Caudill," Marsh said, watching Ferris's face closely. "Near the creek bank. Human remains." Ferris did not flinch. His hands, resting on the porch rail, remained completely still. He shook his head slowly. "Is that so? Lord have mercy. There's old graves all through these woods, Mr. Marsh. From the Civil War, from the cholera times. It's a hard land. It takes people." "These remains appear to have been buried deliberately and hidden," Marsh said. Ferris smiled again, a patronizing curve of the lips. Well, I'm just a farmer, Mr. Marsh. I wouldn't know anything about that. But I trust you and Sheriff Prater will sort it out. If there's nothing else, I have chores to attend to. Marsh left the farmhouse feeling a deep, grinding frustration. Ferris Caudill had been courteous and impossible. He had confirmed everything and admitted nothing. Marsh drove back to the boarding house, convinced he had learned absolutely nothing from the encounter, not yet recognizing that every word Ferris had spoken was a meticulously rehearsed performance, a script polished over 30 years of repetition. Night fell over Harlo County, thick and absolute. Marsh was in his room, reviewing his notes by the light of a kerosene lamp, when a heavy knock sounded at his door. He opened it to find Sheriff Amos Prater filling the doorframe. Prater was heavy through the shoulders, a man whose physical mass was a tool of his authority. He wore his deputy's star from 20 years ago pinned to his leather jacket, rather than his current sheriff's badge. He chewed tobacco slowly, his jaw working with a rhythmic, grinding motion. "Sheriff," Marsh said, "come in." Prater stepped into the room. He did not take off his hat. He looked at the maps and notebooks spread across Marsh's desk. "I hear you had a run-in with Cecil Slusher down at the creek today," Prater said. He walked over to the window, opened it an inch, and spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dark yard below. "He threatened me," Marsh said. "He was carrying a rifle and told me to leave the county." Prater turned back, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Cecil's a loudmouth, but he's also a dangerous man with a temper. He don't like outsiders, and he don't like the federal government taking land he uses. He farms 4 acres of the bottomland," Marsh said, "without a deed." Prater's eyes narrowed slightly. "You've been asking questions." "I'm conducting a survey. The questions are part of the job." Prater sighed, a heavy, rumbling sound in his chest. He stepped closer to Marsh, his physical presence looming in the small room. "Let me give you some friendly advice, Mr. Marsh. You're a city boy. You don't understand how things work up here in the hollows. Cecil Slusher is a powder keg. You keep poking around, asking about land arrangements and old bones, you're going to light the fuse. You would be wise to complete your measurements, file your federal paperwork, and go back to Knoxville without conducting any further interviews that might provoke local conflict." The warning was delivered with a tone of paternal concern. It read as protective. But Marsh was a man who listened to the spaces between words. Prater was not warning him away from the investigation. Prater was warning him away from Slusher. Marsh looked at the sheriff. Prater knew about the 4 acres. Prater knew about Slusher's violent history. Prater knew that Marsh suspected Slusher of the murder in the creek bank, and Prater was actively encouraging that suspicion by telling Marsh to back off. It was a message. Prater is content to let my suspicion of Slusher stand. "I appreciate the advice, Sheriff," Marsh said neutrally. "See that you take it," Prater said. He turned and walked out of the room, his heavy boots thudding down the hallway stairs. Marsh locked the door behind him. He walked back to his desk and sat down. The kerosene lamp flickered, casting long, dancing shadows against the floral wallpaper. He opened his leather field notebook to a blank page. He took his mechanical pencil and began to write up his current theory, pressing the lead firmly into the paper. Cecil Slusher killed the man in the creek bank to protect his access to the bottomland. The land dispute is the motive. Slusher relies on the 4 acres for his livelihood. The federal acquisition threatens that arrangement. Slusher's aggression at the survey site is consciousness of guilt. He is trying to intimidate me into leaving before the remains can be identified and the land cleared. Marsh read over the words. It was a solid theory. It accounted for Slusher's behavior, the motive, and the location of the body. It gave Marsh a clear target. He drew a sharp, straight line under the entry. Beneath the line, he wrote his next required action. Verify burial date. He stared at the page. The logic was sound. The evidence he had gathered pointed directly at Slusher. But as Marsh sat in the silence of the boarding house, listening to the wind howl down the ridges of the hollow, a faint unease settled in his stomach. The entry felt too neat. It relied on Slusher being a reckless, violent fool, but the burial in the creek bank had been careful, methodical, hidden beneath a shelf of limestone. It relied on the victim being a recent threat, but the brass button in Marsh's kit whispered of an older history. It relied on Ferris Caudill being an innocent bystander, but Ferris's rehearsed grief felt like a locked door. Marsh's pencil hovered over the paper. His literal, methodical mind demanded certainty, but his instincts, honed by weeks of navigating the hollow's organized silence, told him that he was missing a structural pillar of the truth. Slowly, deliberately, Marsh lowered the pencil to the paper. At the very end of the sentence, "Verify burial date," he added a small, dark question mark. He closed the notebook, leaving the question trapped in the dark, waiting for the morning. The Morning Post arrived in Caldwell Crossing at 10 o'clock, carried in a canvas sack by a rural route driver who left the engine of his Ford idling while he handed the mail over the counter of the general store. Elliot Marsh stood by the front window, watching the exchange. He had been waiting since the store opened, having walked the 2 miles from the Bledsoe boarding house with his leather field notebook tucked into his breast pocket, the small, dark question mark he had drawn the night before still burning in his mind. The store proprietor sorted the mail into a grid of wooden pigeonholes. When he placed a thick, stiff envelope bearing the seal of the state of Tennessee into the slot marked for transient federal correspondence, Marsh stepped forward and claimed it. He did not open it inside the store. He walked out onto the covered wooden porch, stepping away from the door to avoid the foot traffic of men arriving to buy nails or feed. The air in the hollow was damp and cool, smelling of wet pine needles and wood smoke. Marsh ran his thumb under the flap of the envelope, breaking the seal, and withdrew the single sheet of heavy bond paper. It was the response from his medical examiner contact in Knoxville. Marsh unfolded it and read the typewritten lines with his usual methodical focus. The examiner had reviewed Marsh's detailed sketches of the skeletal remains, paying particular attention to the degradation of the femur and the specific wear patterns on the surviving pelvic fragments. The acidic soil of the creek bank, the examiner noted, accelerated bone decay in a predictable manner. Based on the soil composition Marsh had described and the condition of the exposed joints, the examiner estimated the burial had occurred between 25 and 40 years ago. Marsh read the sentence twice. 25 to 40 years. He folded the letter and slid it back into the envelope. The professional confirmation acted like a chemical catalyst in his mind, instantly altering the fundamental nature of his presence in the hollow. The skeleton in the creek bank was no longer a historical curiosity, an unfortunate pioneer, or a casualty of the Civil War, as Amos Prater had so smoothly suggested. It was a live homicide. The time frame aligned perfectly with the disappearance of Dolan Caudill 30 years prior. This realization forced Marsh to take his theory about Cecil Slusher seriously enough to test it formally. If Slusher had killed the man to protect his access to the bottomland, there had to be a verifiable record of Slusher's presence and his dispute over the land during that specific window of time. Marsh needed paper. He needed the fixed, unalterable facts that the hollow's residents were so determined to withhold. He turned and walked back into the general store. The proprietor, a man with thin hair and wire-rimmed glasses, looked up from a ledger. "I need to see the county newspaper archives," Marsh said. "The weekly editions." The proprietor frowned, a subtle tightening of the jaw that Marsh had come to recognize as the standard local reaction to any question asked by an outsider. "They aren't sorted for public reading, just stacked in the back room." "I have time to sort them," Marsh said. He did not smile, and he did not offer a justification. He simply stood there, a federal surveyor in a pressed canvas coat, waiting for compliance. The proprietor sighed and gestured toward a doorway behind the counter. "Suit yourself. Watch out for the mice." Marsh stepped through the doorway into a windowless back room illuminated only by a single bare bulb hanging from a frayed cord. The space was cramped, filled with wooden crates, sacks of flour, and stacks of the Harlo County weekly newspaper bound in twine. The smell of old newsprint in the general store archive room hit him immediately. A dry, faintly sweet smell, like pressed flowers that have lost their color. It was the scent of trapped time. He removed his coat, draped it over a crate, and pulled his field notebook from his pocket. He found the stacks from 30 years ago, untied the brittle twine, and began to read. He worked methodically, scanning the columns of local gossip, crop prices, and timber yields. He was looking for any mention of Caudill. For 2 hours, the only sound in the room was the dry rustle of turning pages and the occasional scuff of Marsh's boots on the floorboards. Finally, in an edition published in the late autumn of that year, he found it. It was a 4-line notice buried near the bottom of the second page, set in small, unremarkable type. Notice is hereby given that Caudill of the Caudill bottomland has gone west in search of wage employment. His brother, Caudill, has assumed stewardship of the family property and all related affairs. All accounts and business should be directed to Caudill. Marsh copied the notice verbatim into his notebook. He stared at the words. It did not read like a piece of journalism. It read like an announcement composed by Ferris himself, a legalistic planting of a flag. There was no mention of a search, no expression of familial worry, no ambiguity. Dolan was gone, and Ferris was in charge. Marsh turned his attention to Cecil Slusher. If Slusher was the killer, his motive was tied to the 4 acres of bottomland he farmed under an informal arrangement. Marsh needed to establish when Slusher had begun farming that land, when he had first come into conflict with Caudill. He moved to the stacks from 29 years ago, then 28. He scanned the names, running his finger down the columns of print. In the bound stack from 28 years ago, the name Slusher caught his eye. It was a wedding announcement. Cecil Slusher, formerly of this county, was wed to Miss Mary Vance in Bledsoe County. The couple will reside on the Vance family farm. Marsh stopped. Bledsoe County was 2 counties away. He quickly pulled the stacks from 27 years ago, finding nothing. He moved to the stack from 26 years ago. Halfway through the year, he found a brief follow-up notice. Cecil Slusher and his wife have relocated to Harlo County, taking up residence near the ridge. Marsh sat back on his heels. The dust motes danced in the light of the bare bulb. He did the arithmetic in his head, though it required little calculation. Caudill had disappeared 30 years ago. Cecil Slusher had married in Bledsoe County 28 years ago and had not relocated to Harlo County until 26 years ago. Slusher was not in Harlo County when Caudill disappeared. The entire theory collapsed. Marsh sat with the newspaper pages on his lap for a long time. He looked at the wedding announcement, then at the relocation notice. The dates were absolute. They could not be intimidated, and they could not lie. Slusher's hostility at the survey site, the glaring from the tree line, the rifle across the forearm, the thinly veiled threats, had been a distraction. Whether it was deliberately arranged by someone else or simply coincidental to Slusher's own territorial nature, it had successfully consumed Marsh's attention. He had spent 3 days investigating the wrong man. This was the central turn, the moment the architecture of the Hollow's deception revealed its true shape. Marsh handled it the only way his literal mind knew how. He opened his leather notebook to the page where he had written his neat, logical theory about Slusher. He took his mechanical pencil, pressed the lead hard against the paper, and struck a heavy, dark line through the entire section. He crossed out the motive. He crossed out the consciousness of guilt. He crossed out Slusher's name. He turned to a fresh page. He reviewed everything he knew, focusing strictly on what remained when Cecil Slusher was removed from the equation. What remained was the courthouse fire 18 years ago, which had conveniently destroyed all land deed records for the bottomland parcel. What remained were the informal land arrangements Ferris Caudill had made with the other families in the weeks immediately after Dolan's disappearance. What remained was Ferris's composed, rehearsed behavior during their first meeting on the farmhouse porch. Marsh began building a new theory centered entirely on Ferris. A man who killed his brother in a dispute over land would need to control every piece of evidence. He would need to control the narrative of the disappearance, which Ferris had done with the newspaper notice. He would need to control the land itself, which Ferris had done by assuming stewardship. And eventually, he would need to control the official paper trail, which meant the courthouse fire was likely not an accident at all. Marsh closed the notebook. The unease in his stomach was gone, replaced by the cold, heavy certainty of a surveyor who has finally found the true baseline. He left the general store at midday and walked back out to the Caudill bottomland. The sky was overcast, the air heavy with the threat of rain. He retrieved his transit instrument from the locked box in the back of his government Ford truck, carried it to the creek bank, and began to set up the tripod. He needed to finish the boundary measurements to force the issue of the federal acquisition, because the acquisition was the lever that would break Ferris Caudill's control. He was adjusting the brass leveling screws when he heard the heavy crunch of boots on gravel. Marsh turned. Cecil Slusher was walking directly toward him, moving with a fast, jerky aggression. Slusher's face was red, the cords of his neck standing out against his collar. He did not have his rifle, but his hands were balled into fists. "I told you to finish your measurements and go home," Slusher barked, closing the distance between them. "I am finishing my measurements," Marsh said evenly, stepping back from the tripod. Slusher did not stop. He lunged forward, grabbed Marsh by the lapels of his canvas coat, and shoved him violently backward. Marsh stumbled, his shoulder slamming into the transit instrument. The tripod tipped. The sound of the transit instrument hitting the ground was a flat, expensive crack that reversed the balance of the confrontation instantly. Marsh caught his balance and looked down. The brass housing was dented, and the delicate glass of the leveling bubble was shattered, the green fluid bleeding into the dirt. The instrument was ruined. Marsh did not fight back. He did not raise his hands or shout. He simply looked at the broken glass, then looked up at Slusher. The red-faced man was breathing hard, his fists still clenched, but he was staring at the broken instrument with a sudden, dawning horror. Destroying federal property was a line even the Hollow understood. Marsh looked at Slusher's face. He saw the tension in the jaw, the wide, erratic focus of the eyes. He remembered the dates in the newspaper archive. "Why are you so frightened?" Marsh asked directly. His voice was calm, devoid of anger, carrying only an analytical weight. Slusher froze. He released his grip on the air, his hands dropping to his sides. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His expression shifted rapidly from aggression to something closer to shame. He looked at the broken transit, then at Marsh, his shoulders slumping. He was a man trapped in a corner, lashing out because he had no other recourse. Marsh understood for the first time that Slusher was afraid, not predatory. Slusher was terrified of losing the 4 acres of bottomland that fed his family, an arrangement that existed only on Ferris Caudill's ledger. Slusher hadn't killed anyone. He was just a desperate man trying to scare away the future. Slusher turned and walked away, his steps heavy and defeated, disappearing into the tree line without looking back. Marsh carefully picked up the broken transit instrument, placed it in its wooden carrying case, and carried it back to his truck. He drove the rough dirt road back to Caldwell Crossing and parked in front of the Harlo County Sheriff's Office. Sheriff Amos Prater was sitting behind his desk, a brass spittoon at his feet. He wore his deputy's star from 20 years ago pinned to his suspenders. He watched Marsh carry the broken wooden case into the office and set it on the floor. "I need to file a formal complaint," Marsh said. "Assault and destruction of federal property." Cecil Slusher. Prater did not look surprised. He pulled a printed form from a drawer, picked up a fountain pen, and began to write as Marsh detailed the encounter. Prater accepted the paperwork with professional neutrality, asking no questions, offering no apologies for the behavior of his county's residents. He simply filled out the form, his heavy shoulders hunched over the desk. "Sign here," Prater said, turning the paper around. Marsh signed his name in precise, block letters. He picked up the wooden case and turned toward the door. "Mr. Marsh?" Prater said. Marsh stopped and looked back. Prater was leaning back in his chair, staring at the signed complaint. He reached for his tin of tobacco, packed a pinch into his cheek, and spat into the brass spittoon. "Slusher has lived in the Hollow for 26 years, Prater said, without looking up from the desk. And he has never been in trouble that did not start with someone else's provocation." Marsh stood perfectly still. It was the most honest thing Prater had said to him since he arrived in Harlo County. Prater was confirming the timeline, 26 years. He knew Slusher wasn't around when Dolan disappeared, but more importantly, Prater was delivering a message. He was telling Marsh that Slusher was a reactive man, a man who could be provoked into taking the blame for things. It confirmed that Prater wanted Slusher to remain the focus of Marsh's attention. Prater was managing the investigation, trying to steer the federal surveyor toward the loudest, most convenient suspect, keeping the light away from Ferris Caudill. "I'll keep that in mind, Sheriff," Marsh said. He walked out of the office. By the time Marsh finished a meager supper at the boarding house and set out to walk the Hollow Road, the day was ending. The quality of light in the hollow at dusk was not gradual but sudden, as the ridge to the west blocked the sun an hour before true dark, dropping the hollow into blue-gray shadow while the sky above was still pale. The trees became flat, black silhouettes against the fading sky. Marsh walked with a steady, measured pace. The texture of the hollow road at night underfoot was distinct. It was packed clay that held the day's warmth longer than the air, so that Marsh could feel it through his boot soles as he walked. The warmth was a stark contrast to the cooling air against his face. He had gone perhaps a quarter of a mile when he became conscious of being followed. It was not a feeling. Marsh did not trust feelings. It was an auditory fact. Beneath the sound of his own boots on the clay, there was a secondary rhythm. Footsteps on the hollow road behind him. Marsh stopped. The footsteps behind him stopped instantly. The silence of the hollow rushed in to fill the void, the wind in the pines, the distant rush of the creek. Marsh stood motionless for 10 seconds, listening. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the gloom. About 50 yards back, near the edge of the road where the rhododendrons grew thick, a figure stood at the tree line. It was too dark to make out features, but the silhouette was clear against the pale clay of the road. It was too slight, and its movements had been too careful to be Cecil Slusher. "Who's there?" Marsh called out. His voice echoed flatly against the ridges. The figure did not answer. It stepped backward, melting seamlessly into the dark tangle of the rhododendrons. There was the faint rustle of branches, and then nothing. Marsh did not pursue. He knew the terrain belonged to them. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his notebook, and clicked his mechanical pencil. In the dim light, he wrote a single line. Unknown, slight build, not Slusher. He put the notebook away and resumed his walk, changing his destination. He did not return to the boarding house. He turned up the narrow track that led to Nola Garnett's one-room schoolhouse. A single kerosene lamp burned in the window of the schoolhouse. Marsh knocked on the heavy wooden door. A moment later, it opened. Nola Garnett stood in the doorway, thin and precise, wearing a dark wool shawl over her shoulders. She looked at Marsh, then looked past him into the dark hollow before stepping back to let him enter. The schoolhouse smelled of chalk dust and cold wood stove ash. Garnett's composition notebooks, her remembering books, were stacked neatly on the shelf behind her desk. "Mr. Marsh," she said, her voice measured. "It is late for surveying." "I'm not surveying the land tonight, Miss Garnett," Marsh said. He stood in the center of the room, his hat in his hands. He decided to abandon the careful, oblique approach he had used in his previous interviews. The medical examiner's report and the newspaper archives had given him the foundation he needed to push. "I need to know what happened 30 years ago," Marsh said directly, "when Dolan Caudill disappeared." Garnett did not flinch. She walked to her desk and sat down, folding her hands flat on the wooden surface. She was quiet for a long time. The kerosene lamp cast long, flickering shadows across her face, highlighting the sharp, intelligent lines of her jaw. "I was a young woman then," she said finally. Her voice was quiet, stripped of the usual hollow evasions. "I remember it." "What do you remember?" "I remember enough to know that the story Ferris tells is a lie," she said. She looked at the stack of composition notebooks on the shelf. "I wrote it down." Marsh followed her gaze. "What did you write?" She did not offer the notebook, and Marsh, respecting the delicate balance of the moment, did not ask directly for it. "I wrote that Ferris Caudill was the last person I ever saw in Dolan's company," Garnett said. The words hung in the quiet room, heavy with 30 years of suppressed truth. "It is in my remembering books, the exact date, the exact time." Marsh looked at her. "Why have you never told anyone? Why let Ferris control the land, control the story for 3 decades? Garnett's eyes hardened. "I told my father. He was a righteous man. He took what I saw to the county land office. He tried to contest Ferris's claim to the bottomland, to force an inquiry." She paused, her hands tightening slightly on the desk. "His claim was denied for lack of documentation, and the next year our family's access to the winter timber was cut off. We nearly starved. My father died a broken man." She looked up at Marsh, her gaze piercing. "Knowledge without authority is just another weight to carry, Mr. Marsh. It does not bring justice. It only brings ruin to the one who speaks." "I have federal authority," Marsh told her. "I am not the county land office, and I am not Amos Prater. I answer to the Army Corps of Engineers, and they answer to Washington. If you give me the proof, Ferris cannot bury it." Garnett studied his face. She was measuring him, weighing his stubborn, literal nature against the entrenched power of the Caudill family. She knew he did not bluff. "I know you have authority," she said softly. "That is why I am speaking to you at all. But putting it in your hands means destroying the only structure this hollow has left. I need another day to decide whether to show you the notebooks." "The dam will destroy the structure of the hollow regardless," Marsh pointed out. "The dam will take the land," Garnett corrected him. "The truth will take the people. Come back tomorrow." Marsh nodded. He put his hat back on. "Good night, Miss Garnett." The next morning, the sky over Harlo County was the color of bruised iron. Marsh drove his government Ford truck as far as the road allowed, then walked the remaining distance to the Caudill farmhouse. It was his second visit to the property. He did not go to ask about Dolan's disappearance. He went to ask about the machinery of the cover-up. Ferris Caudill received him on the porch, just as he had before. Ferris was slow-moving and deliberate, his broad, flat face giving nothing away. He wore faded overalls, and his hands, thickened from decades of farm work, rested on his knees as he sat in a high-backed rocking chair. "Mr. Marsh," Ferris said, his voice a low, courteous rumble. "We didn't expect to see you back up this way so soon. Have you finished your measurements?" "The survey is proceeding," Marsh said. He remained standing on the porch, looking down at Ferris. "I came to clarify some of the informal land arrangements in the hollow. The federal acquisition requires a full accounting of who uses what land and under what terms." Ferris smiled, a slow, practiced expression. "We have always tried to be fair with our neighbors. What is it you need to know?" "I need to know about the Prater family's grazing rights on the upper ridge," Marsh said. "I need to know about the 4 acres of bottomland, Cecil Slusher Farms. And I need to know about the access road the Bledsoe family uses." Ferris nodded slowly. He did not look surprised by the specificity of the questions. He confirmed each arrangement with quiet pride. "We gave the Praters the grazing rights 29 years ago," Ferris said. "Amos's father needed the grass, and we had it to spare. Cecil Slusher came to us 26 years ago, a hard worker needing a start, so we let him work the bottomland. And the Bledsoes needed the road to keep their boarding house viable. We made these arrangements to keep the hollow together. When my brother left, the responsibility fell to us. We have done our best to be good stewards." Marsh listened to the rehearsed speech. He did not look at Ferris's face. He watched Ferris's hands. As Ferris spoke about the irregular land deals that Marsh now knew were the currency of a 30-year cover-up, the bribes paid to secure the silence of the hollow, his hands remained completely still. They rested flat against the denim of his overalls, not twitching, not tapping, not gripping the fabric. It was not natural. A man being asked uncomfortable questions by a federal agent about undocumented land arrangements should show some sign of nervous energy. A man defending his stewardship should gesture. But Ferris's hands were dead still. It was the physical manifestation of absolute, rigid control. Ferris was holding the narrative together through sheer force of will, ensuring that not a single muscle betrayed him. "Thank you for the clarification, Mr. Caudill," Marsh said. He took out his notebook, made a brief notation, and put it away. "I will include this in my report. We hope the federal government will be as fair to the families of this hollow as we have been," Ferris said, his hands still motionless. "The government is always thorough," Marsh replied. He turned and walked off the porch. That night, Marsh sat at the small wooden desk in his room at the Bledsoe boarding house. The wind howled down the ridges, rattling the window panes. The single lamp cast a pool of yellow light over his open field notebook. He reviewed the timeline he had assembled over the past 48 hours. The medical examiner's report confirming the 30-year burial, the newspaper notice written by Ferris to explain Dolan's absence, the dates proving Slusher was not in the county, the courthouse fire that destroyed the deeds, Nola Garnett's testimony about seeing Ferris follow Dolan, and the land arrangements, the grazing rights, the farming acres, the access roads, handed out by Ferris immediately after the disappearance. Marsh took his mechanical pencil. He pressed the lead to the paper and wrote his new conclusion, his handwriting sharp and precise. Ferris Caudill assumed control of everything, land, arrangements, and the community's version of events in the weeks immediately after his brother vanished. Every family in the hollow has something to lose if that control is exposed. The cover-up is the community. The community is the cover-up. Marsh stared at the words. It was a terrifying architecture of silence. Ferris had not just buried a body in the creek bank. He had buried the truth under a mountain of shared complicity. He had made everyone an accessory after the fact by tying their survival to his crime. Marsh placed the tip of his pencil beneath the final sentence. With a firm, deliberate motion, he underlined it twice. The morning light in the hollow did not arrive so much as it seeped, a slow gray dilution of the dark that offered no warmth. Elliot Marsh woke in the unlocked back room of the Bledsoe boarding house, the narrow bed rigid beneath his spine. He lay still for a moment, listening to the absolute quiet of the house. Harlan Bledsoe had moved his belongings to this room 2 days prior under the pretext of a leaking roof in the front bedroom, a transparent maneuver that Marsh had noted but not contested. The air in the back room was stale, smelling faintly of lye soap and old dust. Marsh sat up, swung his legs over the edge of the mattress, and dressed with his usual mechanical efficiency. He laced his heavy leather boots, feeling the familiar, reassuring stiffness of the leather against his ankles. He moved to the small washstand, splashed cold water on his face, and dried it with a rough cotton towel. Then he turned to his field kit, which sat exactly where he had left it on the uneven floorboards beneath the window. He unbuckled the heavy leather straps and opened the flap. His transit book, his spare pencils, his plumb bob, and his cloth measuring tape were all in their proper compartments. But the heavy manila envelope that had been wedged between the transit book and the canvas tool roll was gone. Marsh did not curse. He did not frantically tear through the rest of the bag. He knelt on the floorboards and methodically checked the adjacent compartments, running his fingers along the canvas seams to confirm what his eyes already knew. The envelope containing his survey photographs of the skeleton, the stark, undeniable proof of the femur and the rusted belt buckle protruding from the creek bank, had been removed. He sat back on his heels, his expression entirely neutral, though his mind was working with the rapid, cold precision of a geared machine. The theft was not a panicked ransacking. Nothing else had been disturbed. The intruder had known exactly what to look for, where to find it, and how to extract it without leaving a trace of disorder. Coming so soon after the missing notebook page and the sudden room change, the theft communicated a specific kind of threat. Whoever was managing his removal from the hollow was patient and systematic. They were not acting out of sudden terror. They were executing a strategy of steady, escalating erasure. It meant they had done this kind of management before. Marsh reached down to his right boot. He slipped his index and middle fingers inside the leather shaft, pressing against the lining just above his ankle. He felt the stiff edge of paper. He withdrew the duplicate set of photographs, folded flat and wrapped in a thin sheet of waxed paper. He had developed 2 sets in the makeshift darkroom he had rigged in his previous boarding house 2 counties over, a habit born of federal bureaucracy rather than paranoia. He unfolded the prints, checked their condition, and carefully slid them back into his boot. They had taken his evidence, but they had not taken his proof. He left the boarding house without speaking to Harlan Bledsoe, who was conspicuously absent from the front room, and walked the 2 miles to the survey site. The morning mist was still clinging to the bottomland, thick and white, obscuring the tree line and turning the landscape into a featureless void. Marsh carried his damaged transit instrument over his shoulder, the heavy wooden tripod digging into his collarbone. When he reached the creek bank, the mist began to burn off, revealing the muddy slope and the dark, quiet water. Marsh set down his equipment and walked the perimeter of his previous day's work. He stopped. He looked at the ground, then looked back toward the tree line, his eyes narrowing. The geometry of the parcel was wrong. It was a subtle discrepancy, the kind of thing a layman would never notice. But Marsh had spent his entire adult life translating the physical world into mathematical certainty. He walked to the nearest boundary marker, a wooden stake he had driven into the earth with a 3-pound sledgehammer 48 hours ago. The earth around the base of the stake was loose. The bright orange surveyor's ribbon tied to the top was free of the morning dew that coated the surrounding grass. Marsh pulled his cloth tape measure from his belt. He anchored the brass ring to the stake and walked backward, feeding the tape through his fingers until he reached the secondary marker. He checked the distance against the coordinates in his field notebook. He was off by exactly 6 feet. He moved to the next stake, and then the next. 3 of his boundary stakes had been pulled from the ground and moved 6 feet south. Marsh stood in the damp grass, looking at the repositioned line. It was a brilliant, understated piece of sabotage. If he had not caught the discrepancy, if he had simply accepted the stakes as he found them and drawn his final maps based on this new line, the north end of the creek bank would be formally excluded from the federal acquisition boundary. The limestone shelf, the eroded soil, and the skeleton buried beneath it would remain on private land. It would fall outside his jurisdiction, outside his authority to document, and outside the purview of the Army Corps of Engineers. The federal government would flood the valley, but the creek bank would remain untouched until the water rose to swallow it forever, burying the evidence under 50 feet of reservoir. Marsh did not dismantle the false line immediately. He went to his kit, took out his survey camera, and checked the film counter. He had 3 exposures left. He spent the next 20 minutes photographing the displaced stakes, ensuring the loose soil and the altered sight lines were clearly visible in the frame. Only when he was satisfied that he had documented the tampering did he pull the stakes from the false holes. He set up his transit instrument. The leveling bubble had been cracked during Cecil Slusher's assault, the fluid sluggish and imprecise, but Marsh knew how to compensate for the damage through manual triangulation. He spent 2 hours restaking the boundary, driving the wooden pegs deep into the original holes, pounding them with the sledgehammer until his shoulders ached, and the geometry of the bottomland was restored to its true federal dimensions. When the work was done, Marsh packed his equipment, walked back to the boarding house, and climbed into his government-issued Ford truck. He did not stop at the sheriff's office. He drove out of the hollow, taking the winding, rutted ridge road that led away from Harlo County. He drove for 18 miles, the landscape gradually shifting from the claustrophobic vertical walls of the Appalachian ridges to the slightly broader valleys of the county seat. The town was small, built around a brick courthouse that looked entirely too grand for the impoverished storefronts that surrounded it. But it possessed the one thing Marsh required: a telegraph office connected to the main trunk lines running west to Knoxville. Marsh parked the Ford, walked into the telegraph office, and requested a standard transmission form. The clerk, a young man with ink-stained fingers and a posture of perpetual boredom, slid the paper across the counter. Marsh took his mechanical pencil and began to write. He did not address the telegram to his direct supervisor. His supervisor was a man who valued smooth operations and frictionless acquisitions, a man who had already ignored Marsh's initial, cautious letter. Instead, Marsh addressed the message to the regional director of the Army Corps of Engineers, 2 levels above his supervisor, a man Marsh had never met, but whose signature authorized the federal checks that would eventually buy Harlo County. The message was precise, stripped of all emotion and speculation. He detailed the discovery of the skeletal remains on the Caudill bottomland. He reported the state medical examiner's estimate of a 25 to 40-year burial. He documented the pattern of local obstruction, the stolen survey photographs, the physical assault by a local resident, and the deliberate, calculated repositioning of the federal boundary stakes to exclude the burial site from the acquisition zone. He requested immediate federal law enforcement intervention to secure the site and protect the integrity of the survey. He handed the form to the clerk. The young man read it, his eyes widening slightly at the words skeletal remains and obstruction, but he said nothing. He tapped out the message on the brass key, the sharp, staccato clicks echoing in the quiet office. "How long for a reply?" Marsh asked. "Depends on Knoxville, mister," the clerk said. "Could be an hour, could be tomorrow." "I will wait," Marsh said. He sat on a hard wooden bench against the wall. He did not read a newspaper. He did not pace. He sat with his hands resting on his knees, his back straight, watching the dust motes drift through the shafts of sunlight that pierced the dirty front window. He waited for 2 hours, the silence of the office broken only by the occasional clatter of the telegraph key receiving routine commercial traffic. Finally, the machine chattered to life with a specific, urgent rhythm. The clerk transcribed the incoming message, tore the paper from the pad, and handed it across the counter. Marsh read it. It contained exactly 5 words. Received and forwarded. Stand by. It was the ultimate bureaucratic non-answer. It acknowledged receipt without promising action, shifting the responsibility into some unseen administrative void. Marsh folded the paper, placed it in his breast pocket, and walked out to his truck. He had expected nothing more, but the confirmation of his isolation was a heavy thing to carry back into the hollow. The drive back to Harlo County began in the late afternoon, the sun dipping behind the western ridges and casting long, bruised shadows across the road. By the time Marsh reached the final 6-mile stretch of the ridge road that descended into Caldwell Crossing, the light had failed completely. The headlights of the Ford cut a narrow, bouncing path through the encroaching darkness. Marsh was navigating a steep, winding grade when the engine sputtered. It was a wet, coughing sound, followed by a sudden loss of power. Marsh pressed the accelerator, but the pedal was dead beneath his boot. The engine died, the sudden silence of the cab absolute, save for the crunch of the tires rolling over the gravel. Marsh wrestled the heavy steering wheel, guiding the coasting truck to the narrow shoulder of the road before the momentum bled away entirely. He engaged the parking brake and stepped out into the night. The air was cool, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. But beneath the natural odors of the forest, there was something else. The smell of the cut fuel line, raw petrol soaking into the dry clay of the ridge road, sharp and chemical against the smell of pine resin and night air. Marsh knelt by the front tire and ran his hand under the chassis, following the metal line that ran from the tank to the engine block. His fingers found the rubber coupling. It was wet. He traced the rubber until his fingers slipped into a clean, smooth gap. The line had not burst from pressure, nor had it snagged on a rogue branch. It had been severed cleanly with a sharp blade. The remaining fuel was dripping steadily into the dirt, pooling in the dark. Marsh stood up and wiped his gasoline-soaked hand on his trousers. He looked down the road. He was 6 miles from the boarding house. The darkness of the hollow was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blackness that seemed to press against his eyes. He had no flashlight. He had only his boots, his coat, and the long road ahead. He began to walk. The journey took nearly 3 hours. The road was uneven, rutted by wagon wheels and washed out by spring rains. Marsh walked with a steady, measured stride, refusing to let the darkness dictate his pace, though every shadow seemed to conceal movement. The silence of the woods was oppressive, broken only by the snap of twigs and the distant, mournful call of a night bird. He was acutely aware of his vulnerability. The man who had cut the fuel line could easily be waiting in the tree line, watching him struggle through the dark. But Marsh did not stop, and he did not look back. He simply put one foot in front of the other, his mind focused entirely on the mechanics of walking. It was well after midnight when he finally saw the faint, yellow glow of the lamps in Caudill Crossing. His legs were heavy, his boots caked with damp clay. He bypassed the boarding house and walked directly to the Harlo County Sheriff's Office. The front door was unlocked. Inside, a single desk lamp illuminated the room. The night deputy, a younger man with a soft jaw and a uniform shirt that was too large for him, was sitting with his boots on the desk, reading a worn magazine. He looked up as Marsh entered, his expression registering mild annoyance rather than surprise. "I need to file a report," Marsh said, his voice hoarse from the cold air and the long silence of the walk. "Sheriff Prater ain't here," the deputy said, not moving his boots. "I am filing it with you," Marsh said. He walked to the desk and stood over the younger man. "My federal survey vehicle has been vandalized. The fuel line was deliberately severed on the Ridge Road 6 miles outside of town." The deputy sighed, swung his legs off the desk, and pulled a ledger from a drawer. He picked up a pen and dipped it in an inkwell. "Where exactly?" 2 miles past the county line marker, Marsh said. The cut was clean. A blade. The deputy wrote it down, his handwriting slow and looping. He did not ask if Marsh had seen anyone. He did not ask if Marsh was injured. He did not appear surprised in the slightest. He was merely logging the paperwork of a warning, acting as a clerk for the Hollow's shadow governance. "Got it," the deputy said, closing the ledger. "We'll look into it when the sun comes up." "See that you do," Marsh said. He turned and walked out into the night, the smell of raw petrol still clinging to his hands. The following morning, Marsh sat on the front porch of the Bledsoe boarding house, a cup of bitter, chicory-laced coffee resting on the railing beside him. His legs ached from the walk, and his eyes were gritty from lack of sleep. He was watching the road, waiting for the mechanic from the general store to organize a tow for the stranded Ford, when a child appeared at the edge of the property. It was a boy, perhaps 8 years old, unnamed and unfamiliar to Marsh. He was barefoot, wearing faded denim overalls that were frayed at the cuffs. The boy walked up the steps, his eyes fixed firmly on the floorboards, and stopped in front of Marsh's chair. Without speaking, the child extended a small, dirt-smudged hand. Pinched between his fingers was a folded piece of paper. Marsh took the paper. The boy immediately turned and ran down the steps, disappearing down the road toward the center of town before Marsh could offer a coin or a question. Marsh unfolded the paper. It was a torn half-sheet of lined composition paper. There was a single line of text written in dark blue ink. The schoolhouse. After the children go home. Marsh recognized the handwriting instantly. It was the same precise vertical script he had seen on the spines of the composition notebook stacked behind Nola Garnett's desk. He spent the rest of the day in his room, reviewing his field notes and waiting for the sun to begin its descent behind the ridges. When the late afternoon shadows finally stretched across the hollow, signaling the end of the school day, Marsh put on his coat and walked the mile to the one-room schoolhouse. The building sat on a slight rise, backed against a dense stand of oak trees. The children were gone, the yard empty save for a solitary rope swing hanging motionless from a thick branch. Marsh climbed the wooden steps and opened the door. The color of the schoolhouse interior at evening, the west-facing windows fill with amber light for 20 minutes after the hollow falls into shadow, making the room look warmer than it is. Nola Garnett was sitting at her desk at the front of the room. Her hands were folded flat on the wooden surface. In front of her lay one of her remembering books, a black and white marbled composition notebook, its cover worn soft at the corners from years of handling. She did not look up as Marsh entered, but she spoke. "Close the door, Mr. Marsh." Marsh closed the door. The latch clicked loudly in the quiet room. He walked down the center aisle between the rows of small, scarred wooden desks and stopped a few feet from her. "You received my message," she said. "I did," Marsh replied. "You said you needed a day to decide whether to show me the notebooks." "I have decided," Garnett said. She did not open the book toward him. Instead, she kept it angled toward herself, her fingers resting lightly on the open pages. "I will not show you the page, but I will read it to you. You are a man who respects records. You will have to respect mine." "I am listening," Marsh said. Garnett looked down at the page. The amber light caught the silver in her hair, illuminating the sharp, uncompromising lines of her face. When she spoke, her voice was stripped of its usual guarded cadence. It was the voice of a historian reciting a primary text. "October the 14th, 1906, she read, her tone flat and precise. "Dusk. The air was turning cold. I was sitting by the window of this schoolhouse, grading slates. I saw Dolan Caudill walking down the hollow road, heading north toward the creek bank. He was walking fast. He was carrying nothing. No bag, no tools, no rifle. He looked angry." She paused, her eyes scanning down the page. 20 minutes later, she continued, "I saw Ferris Caudill pass the same window. He was walking in the same direction, following the path his brother had taken. He was carrying a long-handled spade over his shoulder. He did not look angry. He looked like a man going to work." Garnett closed the notebook. The sound was surprisingly loud in the still room. "Neither man returned past the schoolhouse that evening," she said, looking up at Marsh. "I sat by the window until full dark. I watched the road. Nothing came back down that path except the wind." The next morning, Ferris told the Hollow that Dolan had packed a bag in the night and gone west looking for wage work. Dolan was never seen again. Marsh stood in the amber light, absorbing the weight of the testimony. It was the missing link, the unbroken chain of circumstance that connected the skeleton in the creek bank to the man who now controlled the Hollow. "You saw this," Marsh said quietly. "You wrote it down. You knew what it meant. Why have you never read this entry to anyone outside your own family?" Garnett folded her hands back together. "Because you do not understand the mathematics of this place, Mr. Marsh. 30 years ago, this hollow was starving. Dolan wanted to sell the bottomland to a timber company from Knoxville. If he had done that, the timbermen would have clear-cut the ridges, poisoned the creek, and evicted half the families living on the margins of that land. When Ferris took over, he kept the land. He gave the Praters grazing rights. He gave the Slushers acreage to farm. He gave my father access to the upper timber. He kept the Hollow alive. By murdering his brother, Marsh said. Yes, Garnet said, without flinching. By murdering his brother. My silence was a calculation. The Hollow needed its community intact more than it needed justice for one man who was willing to sell us all out. It was a terrible arithmetic, but it was the only math that kept people from starving. Then why are you speaking now? Marsh asked. Why break the silence after 30 years? Garnet looked past him, toward the west-facing windows where the amber light was beginning to fade into the bruised purple of twilight. Because of your truck, she said. Because of the fuel line. Marsh frowned. You know about that. Everyone knows about it, Garnet said sharply. Ferris has managed this Hollow through quiet leverage for 3 decades. He controlled the land, he controlled the sheriff, and he controlled the narrative. But cutting the fuel line on a federal vehicle on a mountain road at night, that is not leverage. That is an attempt to kill a man who has no part in our history. She stood up, her thin frame rigid with indignation. My calculation has changed, Mr. Marsh. The passive cover-up was a sin we all agreed to carry for the sake of survival. But active endangerment of an innocent party is a line I will not allow this community to cross. I have recorded the history of this land for 30 years. I will not have a federal man's death written into my books. Will you testify to this? Marsh asked. In a formal proceeding. If it comes to that, Garnet said. But you need more than my remembering books to break Ferris Caudill. You need the land to speak. Marsh left the schoolhouse as the last of the light vanished, walking back to the boarding house with the testimony burning in his mind. He had the motive, he had the timeline, and he had a witness to the final moments before the murder. But Garnet was right. It was still a circumstantial case, built on the memories of a woman who admitted to 30 years of complicity. He needed something physical, something undeniable. 2 nights later, the Hollow delivered it. It was 3 a.m, the hour when the cold was deepest and the silence most profound. Marsh was awake, sitting in the dark of his back room, fully dressed, staring at the faint outline of the window frame. He had not slept properly since the walk from the Ridge Road. Then he heard it. The sound of Vera Caudill's knock at the boarding house back door, 4 knocks, evenly spaced, with a pause before the 4th, as if she reconsidered and then committed. Marsh stood up, crossed the room silently, and moved down the narrow hallway to the kitchen. He did not light a lamp. He unbolted the heavy wooden back door and opened it a fraction. Vera Caudill stood on the small porch, her silhouette barely visible against the night sky. She wore a heavy wool shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her face pale and drawn. She did not speak. She simply stepped forward, waiting for Marsh to open the door wider. He stepped back and let her in, closing and bolting the door behind her. He led her to the small wooden table in the center of the kitchen and struck a match, lighting the kerosene lamp. The yellow flame flared, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. Vera stood by the table. She looked exhausted, a bone-deep weariness that seemed to pull at the corners of her eyes and mouth. In her hands, she held a small, faded cloth sack, a flour sack, the kind sold at the general store a decade ago. She set the sack on the table between them. I found this in the wall of the farmhouse, Vera said, her voice barely above a whisper. 11 years ago. We were replacing some rotted boards in the back parlor. It was wedged between the studs down near the floorboards. I have been deciding what to do with it ever since. Marsh looked at the flour sack, then up at Vera. What is it? Vera reached into the sack. Her fingers trembled slightly as she withdrew a folded square of paper. She placed it on the table and slid it toward Marsh. I am giving it to you now, she said, her voice steadying. Because my father-in-law cut the fuel line on your truck, and because I was standing in the hallway when he instructed Harlan Bledsoe to move you to the back room and remove your photographs. Marsh looked at her, registering the magnitude of her admission. She was implicating herself as a witness to the conspiracy, breaking the absolute loyalty of the Caudill family. He reached out and picked up the paper. He unfolded it carefully. The texture of Dolan Caudill's handwritten note. The paper has a slight crumble at the fold lines from years inside the flour sack, and the ink on the final line has blurred slightly, as if the writer's hand was not steady. Marsh held the note near the lamp. The handwriting was entirely different from Nola Garnett's precise script or Ferris Caudill's looping ledger entries. It was hurried, slanted, the letters pressed hard into the paper. The ink was faded to a pale, ghostly blue, but the words were legible. To whoever finds this, I'm going to the creek bank to meet Ferris. We have fought over the timber sale for 3 days. He says I am destroying the family. I see how he looks at me. If I do not return from the bottomland tonight, take this paper to the land office in the county seat. Do not trust Amos Prater. Ferris intends me harm. D. Caudill. Marsh read the note twice. The breath caught in his throat. It was a voice from the grave, a 30-year-old cry for help that had been sealed in the walls of the very house where the murderer slept. The first initial and the surname were consistent with the newspaper notice. The fear was palpable in the blurred ink of the final line. Marsh looked up at Vera. She was watching him, her face a mask of quiet terror and profound relief. You have kept this for 11 years, Marsh said, his voice low. You knew what he did. Why are you coming forward now? Why not a year ago? Why not when you found it? Vera pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders. I have 2 children, Mr. Marsh. They were young when I found this. Ferris controlled everything, the land, the money, the food on our table. If I had brought this to the sheriff, Amos Prater would have buried it, and Ferris would have thrown me out of the house. I stayed silent as long as I believed my children would have something left. I thought, when the dam took the land, they would get the federal compensation. They could start over somewhere else. She looks down at the empty flour sack. But the dam will take everything regardless, she said softly. The land will be gone, the arrangements will be gone, and after what he did to your truck, I realized there is no longer a reason to protect a man I have feared for 22 years. He will kill you to keep his secret, and he will let the hollow drown to keep his pride. I will not carry his sins anymore. If I use this, Marsh said, tapping the note, the investigation will go wide. You know enough to be implicated as an accessory after the fact. The state police will ask why you hid evidence. Let them ask, Vera said. She turned toward the door. I have lived in a prison of his making since the day I married into that family. I am ready for it to burn. She unbolted the back door and slipped out into the darkness, leaving Marsh alone in the kitchen with the lamp and the crumbling piece of paper. Marsh did not sleep for the rest of the night. When the sun finally rose, burning off the morning mist, he returned to his room and sat at his small wooden desk. He took out his field notebook, his transit book, the duplicate photographs from his boot, and a stack of blank federal incident report forms. He spent the remainder of the day preparing a formal written evidentiary statement. He approached the task with the same methodical, literal-minded precision he applied to a land survey. He was not writing a story. He was constructing an inescapable architecture of fact. He began with the physical evidence, the coordinates of the creek bank, the depth of the burial, the state medical examiner's professional assessment of the 25 to 40-year burial date, and the duplicate photographs showing the femur and the rusted belt buckle. He moved to the timeline, the newspaper records establishing Dolan Caudill's disappearance 30 years ago, and the subsequent notices proving Ferris Caudill's immediate assumption of control over the bottomland and the surrounding informal arrangements. He incorporated the witness testimony, a detailed transcription of Nola Garnett's account from her remembering books, placing Ferris Caudill at the scene of the crime with a spade 20 minutes after the victim. Finally, he documented the motive and the premeditation, Vera Caudill's account of finding the hidden note, and a verbatim transcription of Dolan Caudill's final, terrified words. He attached the original note to the master copy of the statement, securing it with a brass paperclip. He wrote the entire document in longhand, his pen moving steadily across the pages, pressing hard enough to leave indentations on the wood of the desk. When the first draft was complete, he copied it twice more, creating 3 identical, comprehensive records of a 30-year-old murder and a community-wide conspiracy. He took the first copy, folded it neatly, and sealed it in a heavy manila envelope. He addressed it to the Regional Army Corps Director in Knoxville, the man who had received his telegram. This was his failsafe, the federal record that could not be burned in a courthouse fire or buried in a sheriff's desk drawer. He took the second copy and placed it in a leather folio. This was the operational document, the lever he would use to force the local machinery of justice into motion. Marsh stood up, his back stiff from hours of writing. He looked out the window. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the hollow. The survey of the Caudill bottomland was nearly complete, but the true measurement of the land had finally been taken. He picked up the leather folio, put on his coat, and walked out of the boarding house to present the statement to Amos Prater. Amos Prater sat in the ladder-backed chair in the corner of Elliot Marsh's room at the Bledsoe boarding house, his heavy shoulders hunched forward, the leather folio resting across his knees. The room was entirely silent except for the sound of Prater's breathing, which was slow and wet, and the occasional sharp friction of heavy paper as he turned a page. Marsh stood by the single window, looking out at the darkening hollow, watching the glass reflect the dim yellow light of the oil lamp on the washstand. He did not pace. He did not offer to clarify any of the points written in the statement. He simply waited, letting the architecture of the 30-year-old crime settle its weight onto the sheriff's shoulders. Prater read the document in full. He read the transcription of the medical examiner's estimate regarding the skeletal remains in the creek bank. He read the verbatim copy of Nola Garnett's entry from her remembering books, placing Ferris Caudill at the burial site with a long-handled spade. He read the account of Vera Caudill finding the hidden note in the farmhouse wall. Finally, he read the transcription of the note itself, Dolan Caudill's last terrified communication to the world, written in fading ink and hidden in the dark for over a decade. When Prater finished the final page, he did not close the folio. He set it down on the small wooden table beside the bed, his thick hands moving with a strange, careful delicacy. He leaned back in the chair and stared at the blank plaster wall opposite him. He stared at it for nearly a minute. The silence stretched, pulling taut across the small room, but Marsh did not break it. He knew the difference between a man searching for a lie and a man preparing to surrender one. "My father died 20 years ago," Prater said. His voice was a low, gravel-thickened rasp that seemed to catch in his throat. He did not look at Marsh. He kept his eyes fixed on the blank wall. It was a bad death. His lungs filled up over a week. On the last night, when the rest of the house was asleep, he called me to the bed. I was 22 years old. I had just pinned on this deputy star. Prater touched the old, tarnished star on his chest, a gesture of unconscious habit. He told me that Ferris Caudill killed Dolan Caudill. He told me that Dolan didn't go west, that he was in the dirt down by the creek. And he told me that the Prater family's grazing rights on the ridge, the grass that kept our cattle from starving that winter, the grass that kept this family alive, was the price of our silence. Prater finally turned his head to look at Marsh. The sheriff's face was gray, the lines around his mouth carved deep by decades of carrying a weight that was not his own, but which he had accepted nonetheless. "I was 22, Prater repeated, the number sounding like an apology he knew was insufficient. "I made a decision that night. I decided that the living mattered more than the dead. I decided that the hollow couldn't survive if I pulled that thread. I have been living with that decision every day since." Marsh absorbed the confession without a change in expression. His literal mind processed the information, slotting it perfectly into the timeline he had constructed. The motive, the cover-up, the complicity of the community, It was all calcified now, hardened into absolute fact. "What do you intend to do now?" Marsh asked, his voice flat and uninflected. Prater looked down at the leather folio. He reached into his breast pocket, produced a fountain pen, and unscrewed the cap. "I intend to sign your statement as a corroborating witness," Prater said. He bent over the table and signed his name at the bottom of the final page, the scratch of the nib loud in the quiet room. He capped the pen and stood up, his knees popping in the stillness. "And then I intend to drive you to Ferris Caudill's farmhouse." "You are going to arrest him," Marsh said. It was a statement, not a question. "No," Prater said heavily. "I will not arrest Ferris myself. I do not have the standing, not with my family's involvement, not with what my father took from him. A county arrest would be contested, and it would tear this hollow apart in a way I won't be responsible for. But I will not obstruct a state arrest either. The jurisdiction is yours to escalate." Prater looked at Marsh, his eyes deadened but resolute. "You need to call for the state police. Get them down here. We will go to the farmhouse before they arrive." Marsh nodded once. He gathered the folio, securing the pages. The nearest telephone that connected to the state lines was at the county seat, 18 miles away over the ridge. His government Ford truck was still disabled, sitting where he had left it after the fuel line had been deliberately cut. "I need a vehicle," Marsh said. "Take Harlan Bledsoe's truck," Prater said. "The keys are in the ignition. He won't stop you. Not tonight." Marsh left the boarding house 10 minutes later. The night air was bitterly cold, the dampness of the creek rising to settle over the hollow in a thick, freezing mist. He found Bledsoe's truck parked near the woodpile, climbed into the cab, and started the engine. The drive to the county seat was a grueling 2-hour round trip over rutted dirt roads that wound blindly through the dark timber. Marsh drove with mechanical focus, his hands tight on the steering wheel, his eyes tracking the narrow beam of the headlights as they cut through the fog. He thought about the geography of the place, how the steep ridges and deep valleys created a physical isolation that bred a specific, claustrophobic kind of loyalty. The Slusher bottomland acres, the Prater grazing rights, the Bledsoe access road. They were all threads in the same web, spun by Ferris Caudill to bind the hollow together over a corpse. He reached the county seat just before midnight. The town was asleep, but the switchboard operator at the local exchange connected him to the state police post in the nearest city. Marsh stood in the cold, drafty hallway of the municipal building, holding the heavy black earpiece to his head. When the state duty officer answered, Marsh described the situation with his usual precise economy of words. He detailed the skeletal remains, the medical examiner's estimate, the written confession of the victim, the eyewitness account of the suspect with a spade, and the corroborating signature of the local county sheriff. The duty officer listened without interrupting. When Marsh finished, the officer asked only 2 questions regarding the exact location of the farmhouse and the potential for armed resistance. 2 officers will arrive tomorrow morning, the duty officer said. 9 o'clock. Keep the suspect on the property. Marsh hung up the telephone. He walked back out into the freezing night, climbed into the borrowed truck, and drove the 18 miles back to Harlo County in the dark. He arrived at the boarding house well after 2 in the morning, his muscles aching from the tension of the road. But he did not sleep. He sat on the edge of his bed, his field notebook open on his lap, reviewing the sequence of events that would unfold at dawn. The following morning, the sky over the hollow was the color of bruised iron. Marsh and Prater drove together to the Caudill farmhouse in the sheriff's cruiser. It was 8 o'clock. They were exactly 1 hour early for the arrival of the state police. Marsh had not explained to Prater why he insisted on going early, and Prater had not asked. But Marsh's reason was entirely consistent with his character. He had spent 2 weeks being stonewalled, misdirected, and lied to by every person in this valley. He had been intimidated, his room had been searched, his equipment damaged, and his life threatened. He wanted to see Ferris Caudill's face when the man understood that the case was complete. He wanted to witness the exact moment the 30-year lie collapsed, before the formal, impersonal machinery of a state arrest removed that human moment from his reach forever. They pulled into the dirt driveway of the Caudill property. The farmhouse sat on a slight rise overlooking the bottomland, its whitewashed boards stark against the dark tree line. Ferris Caudill was already on the porch. He was seated in a woven cane chair, wearing a heavy wool coat, his thick, work-broadened hands resting flat on his knees. He watched the cruiser approach with the same slow, deliberate stillness he had displayed during Marsh's previous visits. Marsh and Prater got out of the vehicle. The morning air was sharp, smelling of frost and damp earth. They walked up the dirt path to the wooden steps of the porch. In their previous encounters, Prater had always maintained a subtle physical distance from Marsh, a spatial alignment that communicated to the Hollow that the sheriff was a local man, merely tolerating a federal nuisance. But this morning, as they reached the top of the steps, Prater did not step away. He stood directly beside Marsh, his heavy shoulders squared, aligning himself entirely with the surveyor and the leather folio Marsh carried under his arm. Ferris Caudill looked at Prater. He looked at the space between Prater and Marsh, and then he looked at Prater's eyes. For the first time since Marsh had arrived in Harlo County, Ferris's composure changed. It was not a collapse, it was not a dramatic breaking of his stoic facade, it was a very slight loosening around the eyes and the mouth, a microscopic slackening of the facial muscles, as if a physical tension he had held in his jaw for 30 years had been marginally released rather than tightened. The absolute control he had maintained over the Hollow, over the land, and over his own features simply ceased to function. Marsh stepped forward. He spoke plainly, his tone devoid of accusation, triumph, or malice. He delivered the facts as if he were reading coordinates from his transit instrument. "The skeletal remains in the creek bank have been examined," Marsh said. "The burial date has been established at 30 years ago, consistent with the disappearance of your brother, Dolan Caudill. We have a handwritten note found in the wall of this house, in Dolan's hand, stating his fear that you intended to do him harm over the sale of the timber. We have a written witness account from Nola Garnett placing you at the creek bank with a spade 20 minutes after Dolan was last seen walking in that direction. And we have the corroborating signature of Sheriff Prater, attesting to the fact that you used the land arrangements of this hollow to purchase the silence of the surrounding families." Ferris listened without speaking. His broad, flat face remained turned toward the bottomland, looking out over the acres he had killed to keep, the acres that the federal government was going to drown beneath millions of gallons of water regardless. He did not look at Marsh. When Marsh finished speaking, the silence on the porch was absolute, save for the distant rushing sound of the creek at the boundary line. Ferris slowly turned his head. He looked at Amos Prater, ignoring Marsh entirely. "I told him not to sell it," Ferris said. His voice was quiet, stripped of the plural pronouns he had used as a shield for decades. "I told him what that land was. I told him it was the only thing that made us men, the only thing that kept us from being wage slaves to the timber bosses in Knoxville." He laughed at me. It was not a confession in legal terms. It did not satisfy the specific requirements of a sworn statement. But it was the first true sentence Ferris Caudill had spoken in 30 years, and the weight of it seemed to settle into the floorboards of the porch. The front door of the farmhouse opened with a soft click of the latch. Vera Caudill stepped out onto the porch. She wore a faded cotton dress and a heavy gray cardigan, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She did not walk toward her father-in-law. She stood beside the door, her posture perfectly still, her face an unreadable mask of endurance. Ferris looked at her. He looked at the woman who had lived under his roof, eaten at his table, and raised his grandchildren, all while knowing exactly what he had buried in the mud of the creek bank. He looked at her for a long, terrible moment, and then he looked away. He turned his gaze back to the bottomland. The silence between them was immense. It contained the entire 22 years of their cohabitation on the land where Ferris had murdered his brother. It contained the meals cooked, the winters survived, the quiet, suffocating terror of a woman trapped in a house with a man she knew to be a killer, waiting for the day the earth would finally give up its dead. Vera did not speak, and Ferris did not look at her again. At precisely 9 o'clock, the sound of an engine echoed up the hollow road. A dark blue state police vehicle turned into the driveway, its tires crunching loudly over the frozen ruts. The car came to a stop behind Prater's cruiser. 2 state police officers stepped out. They wore crisp uniforms and wide-brimmed hats, their movements businesslike, careful, and entirely devoid of the local hesitations that plagued Harlo County. They walked up to the porch. Prater stepped forward, pulling the leather folio from under Marsh's arm. He handed the written statement to the senior officer and stepped back, removing himself from the chain of authority. The officers approached Ferris. They spoke the necessary legal words, their voices clipped and professional. Ferris did not resist. He did not ask for his coat to be buttoned, nor did he look back at the house. He stood up slowly, his joints stiff, and allowed the officers to guide him down the wooden steps. They walked him to the state police vehicle. The senior officer opened the rear door, pressed a hand to the top of Ferris's head, and guided him into the back seat. The officer shut the door. The sound of the state police vehicle door closing behind Ferris Caudill was a heavy, latched sound that carried across the porch and down the hollow road, audible for several seconds in the absolute stillness of the morning. It was the sound of iron meeting iron, the sound of an ending. The officers got into the front seat, put the vehicle in gear, and drove away. The cruiser disappeared around the bend of the timberline, the sound of its engine fading into the rush of the creek. On the porch, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The space was suddenly and completely ordinary. It was no longer a stage for a 30-year tragedy. It was just a wooden porch with peeling white paint, overlooking a mountain view, with a woman standing quietly by the door. The quality of the porch silence after Ferris was taken was not empty but full, as if all the unspoken things in 30 years of Sunday afternoons and harvest suppers on that porch were briefly present in the air, hovering like dust motes in the morning light, before finally dispersing into the wind. Marsh turned to Vera. He touched the brim of his hat, a small gesture of acknowledgement for the courage it had taken to bring him the flour sack note. She nodded once, a fractional dip of her chin, and stepped back inside the house, closing the door softly behind her. Marsh walked down the steps. Prater was already in his cruiser, his hands resting on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. Marsh did not get in. He had work to do. Marsh spent the remainder of that day completing the survey. He walked down to the north end of the bottomland, to the exact section of the creek bank where the skeleton had been found. The state police had already dispatched a recovery team to exhume the rest of the remains, leaving a rectangular depression in the limestone shelf. Marsh set up his transit instrument, leveling the bubble that Cecil Slusher had damaged days earlier, which Marsh had meticulously repaired with a spare vial from his kit. He drove his final stakes into the ground, his heavy mallet striking the wooden heads with rhythmic, echoing thuds. The work was entirely mechanical. He measured the angles, calculated the elevations, and recorded the coordinates in his field notebook. He did it without conscious thought, letting the mathematics of the land fill his mind. It was his way of processing what had happened. The geometry was clean. It did not lie, it did not murder, and it did not keep secrets. As the afternoon waned into evening, the air grew colder. The smell of the bottomland at the end of the survey rose up around him, the rich, dark scent of turned earth from the staking, the cold, mineral tang of the creek water, and the first faint smell of wood smoke drifting down from the farmhouses on the ridge as the evening cooled. It was the smell of ordinary life continuing, indifferent to the men who claimed to own it. When the final stake was driven, Marsh packed his equipment into his canvas bags. He carried his gear back to his truck, loaded it into the bed, and drove the winding dirt road to the one-room schoolhouse. The schoolhouse was empty of children. Marsh knocked on the heavy oak door and stepped inside. Nola Garnett was sitting at her desk at the front of the room, her hands resting flat on the wooden surface. She looked up as Marsh approached. "It is done," Marsh said, stopping a few feet from her desk. "The state police took him this morning." Prater signed the statement. Garnett received the news without a change in expression. She sat perfectly still, her thin, precise features illuminated by the fading light. She nodded once. "Will the dam still go forward?" she asked, her voice steady. "It will," Marsh said. "The survey is complete. The acquisition boundary is confirmed. The valley will be flooded." "I thought so," Garnett said softly. She looked down at her hands. "Will the families of the Hollow be fairly compensated for the acquisition? Now that the Caudill claim is broken, the informal arrangements are void. The people here have nothing on paper." "I will write the reality of the land arrangements into my final report as a formal recommendation," Marsh said. "I will request expedited and equitable compensation for every family displaced, based on historical use rather than legal title." Garnett looked up at him, her dark eyes studying his face. "That is more than I expected from a federal man," she said. She reached across her desk and picked up her remembering book. The color of Nola Garnett's composition notebook, as she closed it for the last time in the schoolhouse scene, was striking. The marbled cover catching the late afternoon light through the west window, black and white, absolute. It looked like a ledger of souls. She placed it carefully into a leather satchel at her feet. The oral history of Harlo County was closed. Marsh left the schoolhouse and drove back to the edge of the bottomland. He parked his truck on the ridge overlooking the valley. The sun had dropped behind the western peaks, casting the hollow in deep, bruised shadows. Marsh sat in the cab of his truck at dusk, the engine ticking as it cooled. His leather field notebook was open on the steering wheel. He uncapped his pen and wrote his final survey entry. He recorded the closing coordinates, the final measurements, and the confirmation of the federal acquisition boundary. His handwriting was small, precise, and perfectly legible. When the technical data was complete, Marsh paused. He looked out through the windshield at the dark line of the creek where Dolan Caudill had lain in the cold earth for 30 years while the world walked over him. Marsh lowered his pen to the bottom of the page. He added a single, non-survey line beneath the coordinates, a line the reader does not see, a private acknowledgement of the blood mixed into the soil he had just measured. He held the pen there for a moment, letting the ink dry, and then he closed the notebook with a soft, definitive snap. Several weeks later, the sterile, brightly lit offices of the Army Corps Regional Headquarters in Knoxville felt like a different planet compared to the claustrophobic shadows of Harlo County. Elliot Marsh stood in front of his supervisor's desk, his posture rigid, his face impassive. Marsh had filed his comprehensive survey report the previous day. Attached to the technical measurements and boundary confirmations was a 4-page supplementary document. In it, Marsh detailed the complex community context of the land acquisition, explaining the informal arrangements, the history of the Caudill stewardship, and the economic devastation the dam would cause to the Praters, the Slushers, the Bledsoes, and the Garnetts. He strongly recommended expedited and equitable compensation for all displaced families, regardless of their lack of formal deeds. His supervisor, a balding man with wire-rimmed glasses and a profound distaste for complications, dropped the 4-page supplement onto his desk. He picked up a red rubber stamp, pressed it into an ink pad, and stamped the front page of Marsh's recommendation. The stamp read, "Outside scope." "We are engineers, Marsh," the supervisor said, not looking up as he sorted the rest of the file. "We measure the land. We do not measure the people on it. The legal department will handle the deeds as they exist on paper. This supplement will not be forwarded to the acquisition board." Marsh did not argue. He knew the futility of debating morality with a bureaucracy. He simply nodded, picked up his hat, and walked out of the office. He walked down the long, linoleum-tiled corridor, his boots making sharp, rhythmic sounds against the floor. He reached the mailroom at the end of the hall. From his interior jacket pocket, he withdrew a folded manila envelope. It contained an exact carbon copy of the 4-page supplementary document. Marsh had already addressed the envelope. He had not addressed it to the acquisition board, nor to the legal department. He had addressed it directly to the regional director of the Army Corps, the same man who had received his telegram from the county seat, the man who possessed the authority to override the bureaucratic machinery. Marsh dropped the envelope into the outgoing brass mail slot. It vanished into the dark with a soft whisper of paper. He turned and walked out of the building, stepping into the bright, indifferent sunlight of the city. Whether the director would read the document, or whether the families of the Harlo would receive their due before the water rose to swallow their history forever, was not stated. Marsh had taken the measure of the land, and he had taken the measure of the truth. The rest belonged to the river.